Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I feel like I'm getting the hang of this thing. We're at chapter 4, Great Expectations. Let's not waste any time. I fully expected to find a constable in the kitchen, waiting to take me up. But not only was there no constable there, not sure why constable is capitalized, but I'm not going to argue, but no discovery had yet been made of the robbery. So just to remind everyone, Pip has been out to the marshes. He's given the food he's stolen from the pantry to the prisoner who he thinks is capable of killing him. And now he's returned home. It's Christmas. And his sister, Mrs. Joe, and he lives with his sister, Mrs. Joe, and the blacksmith, Joe Gargery. Mrs. Joe was prodigiously busy in getting the house ready for the festivities of the day. And Joe had been put upon the kitchen doorstep to keep him out of the dustpan. An article into which his destiny always led him. It's a bit of foreshadowing, I presume. Sooner or later he's gonna walk into the dust and upset his wife. Sooner or later, when my sister was vigorously reaping the floors of her establishment. And where the deuce had you been? That was my poor attempt at dialect. Had you been? Was Mrs. Joe's Christmas salutation when I and my conscience showed ourselves. Again, we get Pip's levity. Pip is such a likable narrator because he has lightheartedness. Of course, it's Dickens' lightheartedness in Pip, Pip, Pip. I said I had been down to hear the carols. What an easy liar. Ah, well. Observed Mrs. Joe. You might have done worse, which we know he has. Not a doubt of that, I thought. Perhaps if I weren't a blacksmith's wife, and what's the same thing, a slave with her apron never off. So I guess that explains what we got in chapter 2. What does she mean when she never takes her apron off? She's always working in the house. So that's the meaning of that talismanic object. She's tethered to the domesticity of the house. I should have been to hear the carols. Christmas morning carols, how evocative, said Mrs. Joe. I'm rather partial to carols myself, and that's the best of reasons for my never hearing any. Joe, who had ventured into the kitchen after me as the dustpan had retired before us, drew the back of his hand across his nose with a conciliatory air. when Mrs. Joe darted a look at him, and when her eyes were withdrawn, secretly crossed his two forefingers and exhibited them to me as our token that Mrs. Joe was in a cross temper. I really love how Joe and Pip have this secret language where they sort of gently poke fun at Pip's sister, Mrs. Joe. Also, it's raining where I am in Chicago, and I can't stress how much I had hoped for this moment, sort of rain, retyping Dickens, quiet house. So it just feels really peaceful. I'm so glad that this project is something I'm doing. And like I said, it doesn't matter if the streams have zero viewers. It keeps my butt in the chair. So this is, I wanted this rain on the roof and the click clack of the typing. So I feel very, very happy in this moment. This was so much her normal state that Joe and I would often, for weeks together, be, as to our fingers, like monumental crusaders, as to their legs. Always crossed, I guess, is the meaning. We were to have a superb dinner. I've noticed just already in these first 3 chapters, when we raided the pantry, and then in chapter 2, when Pip and Joe ate the bread, and then in chapter 3, when the escaped convict eats the food, Dickens really puts a lot of detail and love into food. And in general, I think it's such a good way to have a rich quality to a text. So don't underestimate meals, food, nourriture. It has a lot of associative qualities. We were to have a superb dinner consisting of a leg of pickled pork and greens and a pair of roast stuffed fowls, a handsome mince pie had been made yesterday morning, which accounted for the mincemeat not being missed. And the pudding was already on the boil. Sounds like a delicious meal. These extensive arrangements occasioned us to be cut off unceremoniously in respect of breakfast. For I ain't, said Mrs. Joe, I ain't a-going, oh my god, this dialect really trips me up. I ain't a-going to have no formal cramming and busting and washing up now with what I've got before me. I promise you. It's so true on holiday days, our eating is all messed up because, Thanksgiving, you have less in the morning to save room in your stomach, so it's all odd. So we had our slices served out as if we were 2,000 troops on a forced march, instead of a man and a boy at home. And we took gulps of milk. Sounds delicious. And water. With apologetic countenances. From a jug on the dresser. In the meantime, Mrs. Joe put clean white curtains up and tacked a new flowered flounce across the wide chimney to replace the old one, and uncovered the little state parlor across the passage, which was never uncovered at any other time, but passed the rest of the year in a cool haze of silver paper, which even extended to the 4 little white crockery poodles on the mantel shelf, each with a black nose and a basket of flowers in his mouth. Cute. And each the counterpart of the other. Now I know this is common. Many homes have this room that only is used for special occasions, but it's also foreshadowing of a very great moment in Great Expectations, which I'm sure some people know, where, you know, some things are preserved for a long time. Mrs. Joe was a very clean housekeeper, but had an exquisite art of making her cleanliness more uncomfortable and unacceptable than dirt itself. Cleanliness is next to godliness, and some people do the same by their religion. It's such a nice, this is definitely Dickens and not Pip, right? This idea that people who, you know, cleanliness is undoubtedly a virtue, just as it is to be godly, but those who make it their everything can be very annoying. So it's definitely Dickens's voice creeping in, and I enjoy the social commentary. It may not be for everyone. My sister, having so much to do, was going to church vicariously. That is to say, Joe and I were going. In his working clothes, Joe was a well-knit, characteristic-looking blacksmith. In his holiday clothes, he was more like a scarecrow in good circumstances than anything else. Nothing that he wore fitted him or seemed to belong to him. And everything that he wore then grazed him. Not sure what that means. And everything that he wore then grazed him. On the present festive occasion, he emerged from his room when the blithe bells were going. The picture of misery in a full suit of Sunday penitentials, Okay, so what are blithe bells? Still not sure. And what are Sunday penitentials? Okay, it's like a hymn book, a medieval handbook. But it doesn't really make sense. I'll need to look this up. I don't want to delay, but this is odd. As to me, I think my sister must have had some general idea that I was a young offender whom an accoucheur policeman had taken up. No idea what that French word means. We'll have to look it up. On my birthday, and delivered over to her to be dealt with according to the outraged majesty of the law. I mean, right from the beginning, Pip is on the side of unlawfulness. And this keeps coming up, whether it's his own conscience or aiding and abetting these escaped convicts. I was always treated as if I had insisted on being born in opposition to the dictates of reason, religion, and morality, and against the dissuading arguments of my best friends. Even when I was taken to have a new suit of clothes, the tailor had orders to make them like a kind of reformatory, and on no account to let me have the free use of my limbs. I think Dickens is really good at putting the joke at the end of the sentence. Joe and I going to church, therefore, must have been a moving spectacle for compassionate minds. Yet, what I suffered outside was nothing to what I underwent within. The terrors that had assailed me whenever Mrs. Joe had gone near the pantry or out of the room were only to be equaled by the remorse with which my mind dwelt on what my hands had done. It's so true as a child when you do something wrong and you're waiting to be discovered. That's a particular type of terror. Under the weight of my wicked secret, I pondered whether the church would be powerful enough to shield me from the vengeance of the terrible young man, who he still believes in, Pip, if I divulged to that establishment, well, in confession, I presume, I conceived the idea that the time when the bonds was read, and when, so the bonds, if I'm correct, is the marriage notices. So presuming when they go to church, some marriage notices will be read, or maybe just general notices. I don't know much about churches. And when the clergyman said, "Ye are now to declare it," would be the time for me to rise and propose a private conference, because this must be Church of England, in the vestry. I am far from being sure that I might not have astonished our small congregation, I love the word congregation, by resorting to this extreme measure, but for its being Christmas Day and no Sunday. Mr. Wopsle, the clerk at church, was to dine with us, and Mr. Hubble, the wheelwright, great word, wheelwright, and Mrs. Hubble and Uncle Pumblechook. Dickens has great names. Pumblechook. Joe's uncle, but Mrs. Joe appropriated him. That's sweet. Who was a well-to-do corn chandler in the nearest town, and drove his own chaise cart. The dinner hour was 1:30 when Joe and I got home. So, when to speed up things, when to dilate time. Like, I would have expected a church scene where Pip is racked with guilt. But for whatever reason, Dickens chooses to speed up time and have church move quickly and bring us back to Christmas dinner. When Joe and I got home, we found the table laid and Mrs. Joe dressed and the dinner dressing and the front door unlocked. It never was at any other time. For the company to enter by, and everything most splendid, and still not a word of the robbery. So that's the active enigma within the house. When will Pip's thievery be discovered? The time came without bringing with it any relief to my feelings, and the company came. Mr. Wopsle, united to a Roman nose and a large, shining, bald forehead, had a deep voice which he was uncommonly proud of. Indeed, it was understood among his acquaintance that if you could only give him his head, he would read the clergyman into fits. He himself confessed that if the church was thrown open, meaning to competition, he would not despair of making his mark in it. I guess what's he saying? That he'd like to be, like he wants to be a clergyman. I don't really fully understand this sort of the church being thrown open. Like, I guess you have to go through some sort of training, like a seminary, in order to become a clergyman, and this guy just wants it to be more like America, where like anyone can be a preacher because he likes to talk. That's my guess, but I really don't get it. The church not being thrown open. He was, as I have said, our clerk, but he punished the amens tremendously. And when he gave out the psalm, always giving the whole verse, he looked all round the congregation, first as much as to say, "You have heard my friend overhead. Oblige me with your opinion of this style." So really, the description, as I understand it, of Mr. Wopsle is he likes his own voice, and he thinks of himself as sort of a preacher and thinks everyone should be impressed with him. I had a lot of typos in that paragraph, so it's probably a good time to just take stock, have some tea. And speed up by slowing down. I opened the door to the company, making believe that it was a habit of ours to open that door. And I opened it first to Mr. Wopsle, next to Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, and last of all, to Uncle Pumblechook. I think NB is like a note to the reader, or like sort of like PS, like NB. I'll have to refresh my memory what it means. I was not allowed to call him uncle under the severest penalties. Mrs. Joe, said Uncle Pumblechook. What a name. A large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man. Brutal. I really feel like that describes me and almost everyone I know. With a mouth like a fish. Dull, staring eyes, and sandy hair standing upright on his head. It's a great description. So, why every time I do O's, it does like a double tap? I have to look into that. So that he looked as if he had just been all but choked, and had that moment come to, I have brought you, as the compliments of the season, I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of sherry wine. And I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of port wine. I'm not sure what this mum and mum is. Must be like an endearment, like dear. Every Christmas day, he presented himself as a profound novelty, with exactly the same words, and carrying the 2 bottles like dumbbells. Dumbbells, I've never really thought about that word. Basically bells that don't make sounds. So oxymoronic, or bells that don't have a function. Very, very interesting word. Every Christmas day, Mrs. Joe replied, as she now replied, "Oh, Uncle Pumblechook," she really likes him. "Uncle Pumblechook, this is kind." Every Christmas day, he retorted, as he now retorted, "It's no more than your merits." How sweet. They have a nice relationship. "And now you are all bobbish. And how's sixpennorth of halfpence?" Meaning me. I'm guessing that means like shorty, like little guy. But I like this paragraph because it is every Christmas day he presented himself as a profound novelty, because you want, sometimes I see students like do things that always happen versus specific scenes that are happening in the moment. And here we see something that always happens, a generality, but with this, as she now replied and as he now retorted, it's also present action. So it's not just saying this happened every Christmas day, it is saying that, but also showing it in the present action as well. So it's a pretty nifty technical thing that Dickens has done. "We dined on these occasions in the kitchen and adjourned for the nuts and oranges and apples to the parlor, which was a change very like Joe's change from his working clothes to his Sunday dress. My sister was uncommonly lively on the present occasion, and indeed was generally more gracious in the society of Mrs. Hubble than in other company. I remember Mrs. Hubble as a little curly, sharp-edged person in sky blue who held a conventionally juvenile position because she had married Mr. Hubble. And I don't know at what remote period when she was much younger than he, Okay, so there's a big age difference between Mrs. Hubble and Mr. Hubble. I remember Mr. Hubble as a tough, high-shouldered, that's a good adjective, high-shouldered, stooping old man of a sawdusty fragrance, brutal, with his legs extraordinarily wide apart, so that in my short days, I always saw some miles of open country between them when I met him coming up the lane. What an extraordinary visual. Like, Dickens really takes his time, goes slow, paints a picture. I know it's 180,000 words, and that's much longer than most contemporary novels, but I think there's a lot to be said for slowing down and taking your time with a physical description. Not just how the person looks with adjectives, but how they made one feel, particularly child narrators. Among this good company, I should have felt myself, even if I hadn't robbed the pantry in a false position. Not because I was squeezed in at an acute angle of the tablecloth, with the table in my chest, poor Pip. And the Pumblechuckian, that's a Dickens word if there ever was one, and the Pumblechuckian elbow in my eye, nor because I was not allowed to speak. I didn't want to speak. Nor because I was regaled with the scaly tips of the drumsticks in the fowls, and with those obscure corners of pork of which the pig, when living, had had the least reason to be vain. Poor guy gets the worst bits. No, I should not have minded. This just obscure corners of pork is making me crave dim sum. No, I should not have minded that if they would only have left me alone. Poor guy. But they wouldn't leave me alone. They seemed to think the opportunity lost. If they failed to point the conversation at me every now and then and stick the point into me, I might have been an unfortunate little bull in a Spanish arena. I think when he makes these comparisons and these metaphors, I know this is a basically an A to B analogy. I think he really chooses good ones. I might have been an unfortunate little bull in a Spanish arena. I got so smartly touched up by these moral goads. Poor guy. They go after him. It began the moment we sat down to dinner. Mr. Wopsle said grace with theatrical declamation, as it now appears to me, something like a religious cross of the ghost in Hamlet with Richard III, and ended with the very proper aspiration that we might be truly grateful. It's one of the things about having a shared canon or shared texts in a culture, that you can make references and be confident that everyone has read or seen Hamlet and Richard III. I think Richard III is the one, I'm pretty sure, where Richard is like evil and deformed. So yeah, pretty funny, Mr. Wopsle, how he says grace. Upon which my sister fixed me with her eye and said in a low, reproachful voice, "Do you hear that? Be grateful." Poor Pip. It is so true in adult company. Sometimes kids can be excessively moralized too. Like, do this, be grateful. Don't you know your ex does so much for you? So it's a really good, Dickens has really inhabited this child narrator very well. Especially, said Mr. Pumblechook, be grateful, boy, to them which brought you up by hand. And that's a way, right, to like compliment the host, is to like say, be grateful to your parents. Mrs. Hubble shook her head, and contemplating me with a mournful presentation. I just love mournful presentiment that I should come to no good. Oh my god, that's funny. Asked, why is it that the young are never grateful? Poor guy, he's doing nothing to deserve this. This moral mystery seemed too much for the company, until Mr. Hubble tersely solved it by saying, naturally vicious. Everybody then murmured, true, and looked at me in a particularly unpleasant and personal manner. We really feel how he's being singled out. I think this is obviously a very funny scene, and it's so useful for practitioners to see a group dining scene, Christmas. It's so useful because handling groups when you're doing information and sequence writing can be difficult. Joe's station and influence were something feebler, poor guy, Joe, if possible, when there was company than when there was none. But he always aided and comforted me when he could. Yeah, Joe and Pip have a great relationship in some way of his own, and he always did it so at dinner time by giving me gravy, if there were any. What a lovely gesture. There being plenty of gravy today, Joe spooned into my plate. At this point, about half a pint. A little later on in the dinner, Mr. Wopsle reviewed the sermon with some severity. So we are going back to church a bit. And intimated, in the usual hypothetical, case of the church, maybe the church being thrown open is like a day where everyone gets to speak, even lay people. Being thrown open, what kind of sermon he would have given them after favoring them with some heads of that discourse. He remarked that he considered the subject of the day's homily ill-chosen, which was less excusable, he added, when there were so many subjects going about. So Mr. Wopsle disapproves of whatever the sermon was about. True again, said Uncle Pumblechook. You've hit it, sir. Plenty of subjects going about. For them that know how to put salt upon their tails. Not sure what that idiom means. That's what's wanted. A man needn't go far to find a subject if he's ready with his salt box. What does salt? Let's just quickly Google it, but I don't want to waste too much time. Salt upon their tails. What does that mean? It's a metaphor for a naive, impossible, or highly improbable method of capturing something. So it's used to describe people who are gullible. Mr. Pumblechook added, after a short interval of reflection, look at pork alone. There's a subject. If you want a subject, look at pork. True, sir. Many a moral for the young, returned Mr. Wopsle. And I knew he was going to lug me in before he said it. Might be deduced from that text. I remember lug used to be a big part of our slang in boarding school, like moving objects was called lugging. You listen to this, said my sister to me in a severe parenthesis. God, Raghav. Joe gave me some more gravy. Poor Joe, he knows that Pip is in for it. Swine, pursued Mr. Wopsle, in his deepest voice. Poor Pip just being lectured on Christmas Day, and pointing his fork at my blushes, as if he were mentioning my Christian name. If you were mentioning. Swine were the companions of the prodigal. the gluttony of swine is put before us as an example to the young. I thought this pretty well in him, who had been praising up the pork for being so plump and juicy. Basically pointing out that people who really like to lecture on religion can often be quite hypocritical. What is detestable in a pig is more detestable in a boy. Or girl, suggested Mr. Hubble. Of course, or girl, Mr. Hubble, assented Mr. Wopsle, rather irritably. But there is no girl present. Besides, said Mr. Pumblechook, that name never gets old. Mr. Pumblechook turning sharp on me. Think what you've got to be grateful for. If you'd been born a squeaker, is that slang for pig? He was, or maybe like a crying child, if ever a child was. How sad, said my sister most emphatically. Joe gave me some more gravy. So we know it's such a nice shorthand that Dickens has created for Pip getting beat up on, is Joe giving him some more gravy. And it again shows how to use group dynamics well. I'll take a quick sip of tea. I've been making lots of typos. Well, but I mean a 4-footed squeaker. I have no idea what he means. I have to look this up and let you know next week, said Mr. Pumblechook. Pumblechook. If you had been born such, would you have been here now? Not you. Yeah, that's what I thought. I think he's referring to a pig. Unless in that form, said Mr. Wopsle, saying if you were born a pig, you'd be on the table, nodding towards the dish. But I don't mean in that form, sir, returned Mr. Pumblechook, who had an objection to being interrupted. I mean enjoying himself with his elders and betters, and improving himself in their conversation, and rolling in the lap of luxury. Would he have been doing that? No, he wouldn't. And what would have been your destination? Turning on me again. You would have been disposed of for so many shillings according to the market price of the article. And Dunstable the butcher would have come up to you as you lay in your straw. Wow, they're really going with this comparison. And he would have whipped you under his left arm, and with his right he would have tucked up his frock to get, they're really going to stick him like a pig in this hypothetical, to get a penknife from out his waistcoat pocket, and he would have shed your blood and had your life. No bringing up by hand then, not a bit of it. Poor kid. Joe offered me more gravy, which I was afraid to take. Almost like the gravy is leading to the continued teasing. He was a world of trouble to you, ma'am, said Mrs. Hubble, commiserating my sister. Trouble, echoed my sister. Trouble? And then entered on a fearful catalogue of all the illnesses I had been guilty of. Wonderful phrasing, because obviously a kid is not guilty of their sicknesses. And all the acts of sleeplessness I had committed, and all the high places I had tumbled from, and all the low places I had tumbled into, and all the injuries I had done myself, as someone who is currently in the throes of constantly having to pick up my daughter or prevent her from banging her head right before she's about to. I do have some sympathy for Mrs. Joe at the moment. And all the times she had wished me in my grave. Oh, poor little Pip. And I had contumaciously refused to go there. Pip is a survivor. 5 brothers in the grave, he's a survivor. I think the Romans, but also the topic of his destiny has come up. And the title of the book is Great Expectations, and we know he's destined to be Joe's apprentice. So this talk about Pip's future, it's comedic, but it's actually also thematically relevant. I think the Romans must have aggravated one another very much with their noses. Perhaps they became the restless people they were in consequence. So does he mean a Roman nose, or is he talking about like the Romani people? I think it's the Roman nose, but maybe like the ancient Romans were restless because they were always conquering. Anyhow, Mr. Wopsle's Roman nose so aggravated me during the recital of my misdemeanors that I should have liked to pull it until he howled. Nice to see that Pip has some fight back in him. No, I misdemeanors, I correctly spelled it the British way, and then I fixed it. But all I had endured up to this time was nothing in comparison with the awful feelings that took possession of me when the pause was broken, which ensued upon my sister's recital. And in which pause everybody had looked at me, as I felt painfully conscious with indignation and abhorrence. Yet, said Mr. Pumblechook, leading the company gently back to the theme from which they had strayed. Pork, regarded as biled, is rich too, ain't it? Have a little brandy, uncle, said my sister. Oh, heavens! It had come at last. He would find it was weak. He would say it was weak. And I was lost, because remember, Pip has diluted the brandy. I held tight to the leg of the table under the cloth with both hands and awaited my fate. That's a good little tactile sensory detail. My sister went for the stone bottle, came back with the stone bottle, and poured his brandy out. No one else taking any. The wretched man trifled with his glass, took it up, looked at it through the light, put it down, prolonged my misery. All this time, Mrs. Joe and Joe were briskly clearing the table for the pie and pudding. I couldn't keep my eyes off him, always holding tight by the leg of the table with my hands and feet. I saw the miserable creature finger his glass playfully, take it up, smile, throw his head back, and drink the brandy off. Instantly afterwards, the company were seized with unspeakable consternation, owing to his springing to his feet, turning round several times in an appalling, spasmodic. I need to have some tea because typos are coming thick and fast. We've crossed the hour mark today. Turning round several times in an appalling, spasmodic, whooping cough dance. And rushing out at the door, he then became visible through the window, violently plunging and expectorating. Making the most hideous faces, and apparently out of his mind. So he's had this diluted brandy and he's had this strong reaction. I held on tight. Again, Dickens sets up a sensory detail and then returns to it 3 times. I held on tight while Mrs. Joe and Joe ran to him. I didn't know how I had done it. We know that has something to do with Pip diluting the bottle. But I had no doubt I had murdered him somehow. This is how the child's mind runs, at least Pip's, where every time he does something, he takes it to the extreme. In my dreadful situation, it was a relief when he was brought back and surveying the company all round as if they had disagreed with him. I think using disagree as a pun because like the drink disagreed with Uncle Pumblechook, sank down into his chair with the one significant gasp. Significant gasp. Tar. I had filled up the bottle from the tar water jug. I knew he would be worse by and by. So if you guys remember in chapter 2, we know that Mrs. Joe forces poor Pip to drink the horrible tar water. And it's a nice bit of the tar water returning just 2 chapters later in this funny situation where Uncle Pumblechook, thinking he's drinking brandy, is actually drinking brandy diluted with tar water. I knew he would be worse by and by. I moved the table like a medium of the present day by the vigor of my unseen hold on it. That's, again, another great analogy, or simile in this case. Tar, cried my sister in amazement. Why, however, could tar come there? But Uncle Pumblechook, who was omnipotent in that kitchen, wouldn't hear the word, wouldn't hear of the subject, imperiously waved it all away with his hand and asked for hot gin and water. That sounds delicious. My sister, who had begun to be alarmingly meditative. So this is how he knows that she's thinking. Alarmingly meditative, had to employ herself actively in getting the gin, the hot water, the sugar, and the lemon peel, and mixing them. For the time being at least, I was saved. I still held on to the leg of the table. But clutched it now with the fervor of gratitude. I don't know why, as the session goes on, my typing is sometimes I feel it improves and sometimes it gets worse. By degrees, I became calm enough to release my grasp and partake of pudding. Mr. Pumblechook partook of pudding. All partook of pudding. The course terminated, and Mr. Pumblechook had begun to beam under the genial influence of gin and water. I began to think I should get over the day. It's just when you think you're out of the soup, out of the water, that the bad thing happens. When my sister said to Joe, "Clean plates, cold," I clutched the leg of the table again. So a tiny enigma. What does clean plates cold mean? Immediately, and pressed it to my bosom, as if it had been the companion of my youth and friend of my soul. I foresaw what was coming, and I felt that this time I was really gone. I think what has sustained this group Christmas dinner the whole time is the internal tension and stress that Pip is under because of this crime being undiscovered. So that undiscovered crime has been the engine of conflict and drama for an entire comedic chapter, chapter 4. "You must taste," said my sister, addressing the guests with her best grace. "You must taste. To finish with, such a delightful and delicious present of Uncle Pumblechook's. Must they let them hope not to taste it? You must know," said my sister, rising. "It's a pie, a savory pork pie, which we know Pip gave to the escaped convict." The company murmured their compliments. Uncle Pumblechook, sensible of having deserved well of his fellow creatures, said, quite vivaciously, changes things, vivaciously, all things considered. Well, Mrs. Joe, we'll do our best endeavors. Let us have a cut at this same pie. My sister went out to get it. I heard her steps proceed to the pantry. I saw Mr. Pumblechook balance his knife. I saw reawakening appetite in the Roman nostrils of Mr. Wopsle. I heard Mr. Hubble remark that a bit of savory pork pie would lay atop of anything you could mention and do no harm. And I heard Joe say, "You shall have some, Pip," ironic. I have never been absolutely certain whether I uttered a shrill yell of terror merely in spirit or in the bodily hearing of the company. So he's reached his breaking point. I felt that I could bear no more and that I must run away. I released the leg of the table and ran for my life. So that's it. He couldn't take any more. We're nearly at the end of the chapter. But I ran no farther than the house door, for there I ran head foremost into a party of soldiers. Who saw that coming? With their muskets, one of whom held out a pair of handcuffs to me, saying, "Here you are. Look sharp. Come on." And so we end on a nice cliffhanger. Why have the soldiers come to Joe Gargery's house? And why have they given Pip these handcuffs and said, "Here you are"? So we've had this comedic scene inside the domestic sphere. Outside on the marshes are the escaped convicts. The big bad world is outside. Here we have the cozy comedic scene, although Pip is getting roasted by their comments, and on the inside by his guilty conscience for having stolen from the pantry, and he's afraid of discovery. And it ends with this party of soldiers. So he's so good, I think, Dickens, at these set piece, these chapters, just like achieving their purpose. And I learned a lot about how to handle a group scene and comedy. So this was a really fun session, long session, 3,300 words, but nice way to end this week's. This has been the fourth session, and it's really going terrific. And whether you're listening to this way in the future at 2x speed, thank you for being part of this project, and see you at future type-alongs.